Yeah, Scotty Scheffler here at the top of the board this week, coming in at a 12,800 salary. 35% ownership seems to be in line. He hasn't really paid off that salary quite yet this year, but obviously two-time defending champion. He's got to be in play at least in a lot of lineups. Certainly, if nobody else in the top 5 or 6 priced golfers perform and he ends up coming in the top 5, you're going to need him in your lineup more than likely with how the scoring distribution will work. So it's definitely not a fade for me at 12,800, but at 4-1 odds, I still think it's a fade for me in the outright market. However, when we look at a lot of the other bets, and there are so many bets that are available for the Players' Championship, a couple that I like, I think you could get off to a good start. Looks like the weather's going to be perfect tomorrow. Somewhere in the first round top 10 or first round top 5. You can get first round top 10 odds for about plus 200. You can get first round top 5 odds for plus 400. That's similar to what you can get for his to win odds. Also, on top of that, if you're really looking for a prop bet here on Scotty Scheffler, the first round bogey free of plus 750. We see if Scotty actually now is really hyped up to be one of the first-time, 3-time defending champions of the event. Then I think it's very possible that he could get off to a great start, and bogey free is certainly in the cards if we get all of Scotty Scheffler's game working. Certainly last week, it's really just been one part of his game that has failed him. If you look at his stats from the previous week where they played the Arnold Palmer Invitational, again, lost roughly 5 strokes putting, 5.2 strokes putting, but the rest of his game was pretty good. Around the green and off the tee was great. And statistically, he's been the best iron player over the last 2 years by a wide number. So I like that to bounce back. So the first round bogey free plus 750 for me seems like a really good place to start. We move on to Rory McIlroy here next, coming in at 11,500 with 18% projected ownership. It's actually pretty reasonable, Rory. I think there's a possibility you can get overweight on his expected ownership of 18%. Not too much. I don't think you need to go too far over that 18 if you're a multi-mass entry player on DFS. I think somewhere in that 20% range for Rory. Given that we have seen top-end form here recently within the last month, winning the Pebble Beach event, which was a shorter track. Now, he was able to overpower that golf course. However, I think there's an opportunity, at least in a couple of spots here at Sawgrass, to take advantage of his length if he can find the fairway. So if he can get the right setup of his bag, which has been widely reported upon this week of being a change, as Rory has been changing a lot of the clubs, specifically his woods and driver in his bag. If he can figure that out this week, certainly he can go right into contending. Now, in terms of betting for Rory McIlroy this week, I think looking at his live odds, if it can get up to around plus 1,000 or better for him to win, I think that's good. Maybe a fast start for a really good golfer like Scheffler, and maybe a slower start for McIlroy would give us that. So certainly we'll look to add Rory McIlroy as well into the later parts of the double digits there, somewhere around 20 to 25 to 1. You can get him right now 14 to 1 to win on ESPN Bet. If you have that available, that is getting pretty close to value that I would certainly start to take a look at here for Rory. Xander Schauffele seems to be the perennial go-to under-owned star here this week for DFS purposes. I think that at a 10% ownership, playing off of a bounce back and a rusty start at the Arnold Palmer Invitational, I think Schauffele certainly has the opportunity to perform well. He's done so here at this golf course, TPC Sawgrass before, with a couple of high finishes, and really was just his around the green game that was bad last week at the Arnold Palmer Invitational, his first week back. And we know that the rough at Bay Hill, as compared to TPC Sawgrass, is typically, especially around the greens, significantly harder to deal with. So I think we should see some positive regression in that statistical category. If the others maintain their rate of increase that we saw last week and maybe gets better as he gets a couple more rounds under him, I certainly think that he could be right in the mix. So certainly 10% ownership on DFS I do like, and if you can find certainly, if you can find Xander's roughly odds in the 30-1 or higher range to win, it's certainly something to take a look at, especially if you can get a 3-1 on that top 20, or even a plus 150 or plus 200 on the top 20. Certainly think those are all in play this week for Xander. Next is Colin Morikawa, who is widely been touted as a golfer that a lot of people like this week. Coming in with a projected ownership of 25% at a price of $10,500 seems very reasonable. I don't think you need to go crazy on getting overweight here for DFS purposes. As 25% seems reasonable. However, he is very close to winning. Obviously, not being able to close out the Arnold Palmer this week is disappointing from a perspective of the fan. However, second place finish is still widely accepted, especially for DraftKings purposes. Now, when we go over to the betting market, obviously, when you bet on him to win and he comes in second, it's a big sting. So it's a little bit different, obviously, when we move over to the betting market. But specifically for Colin Morikawa this week, I do think the way he's playing and the motivation he has, a top 10 bet is one of the safer bets on the board this week that you can look to. I think that the course is perfectly set up for him. And right now, the best odds you can find are plus 180 on ESPN Bet for the Colin Morikawa top 10. As we move on to Ludwig Aberg, Ludwig actually moved to this area last November and has already had a big victory early on the season. So I think he's another guy that a lot of people should target, and certainly comes in with better to win odds versus a Colin Morikawa that we just talked about, who's now 14-1 to win. The second now guy on the odds board is Morikawa. Now, going back to Aberg. Aberg on the other side is also in that 16 range and does also present some solid upside. Now, when we look at last week, some people may look at the stats from last week and be like, oh, well, how did he lose strokes off of the strokes gained on the approach? Ludwig is one of obviously the best iron players in the world, and he lost 3.2 strokes for the week. But if you dig in, this is where stats can kind of disillude things, if you will. Set a picture that may not be all that real. And here's what happened to Ludwig. So he lost 3.2 strokes for the entire tournament on his strokes gained on the approach, right? Well, for just one hole, his third round on Saturday, the 8th hole, his approach shots, as I mentioned, lost 3.44 strokes just on that one hole. So for the rest of the tournament, for the other 71 holes, he gained 0.21 strokes. Now, if we take that shot out and the one that he hit on 18 in the water, which was 1.3 strokes, so now we're up to a total of 4.7 strokes that he lost on his approaches in just 2 holes. So for the other 70 holes, he gained almost a stroke around, which is more or less in line with his statistical average. So we can understand why going back to Ludwig Aberg makes a ton of sense here this week. You've got a couple of things that you can take a look at. Russell Henley, coming off of a big win, is matched up against Ludwig Aberg in a first round matchup. This is not the 3-ball matchup. This is just a first round matchup. -110 odds on Hard Rock are pretty good there for that matchup. Henley coming off a big win. There could be a chance for a letdown there as we talk about Russell Henley. For me, that's a huge win for a guy like Russell Henley, who's been knocking on the door for a long time. Maybe he keeps it up this week, but I'm actually going to play the other side. I'd rather go to other golfers in that range or end up paying up, especially in DFS purposes, paying up for a guy like Aberg or Morikawa and going down cheaper for one of those third or fourth guys. And on the betting side, yeah, we don't need to get to Russell Henley. So for an obscure bet for Ludwig Aberg, certainly like the first round matchup against Russell Henley in that market. Hideki Matsuyama is another guy that is a target in this range, upper range. We're going to get 20% ownership at 9,900 salary. Seems very appropriate with his level of play this season. We've seen the top side of the Central Tournament of Champions winning that event. He certainly looks to be in position to win another big event here. Certainly a 9,900 versus some of those guys that are slightly cheaper than him. I like him a lot more. Also like Tommy Fleetwood quite a bit in this range. In terms of the betting market, Hideki Matsuyama at 30-1, I think is a good second guy. You want to pick one of those Morikawa or Abergs, that's totally fine at 16-1. Your second guy, I think, on the betting card should be Hideki Matsuyama. He's coming in at around 30-1 odds this week. Unless you want to go Xander Schauffele for that bounce back, I think Hideki Matsuyama is a really good second choice. I think adding Matsuyama and both Fleetwood makes the card a little short. So I do think adding one or two of those guys is a better option. For me, it's in the mid 9K range, both on the betting side and on the DFS side. It is more or less a fade. Sungjae Im at 4.8% ownership. Maybe I'll have slightly overweight there just due to the fact that it is very low ownership. Daniel Berger at 9,600 does have great course history here. One of the best, in fact, of ability to get to the weekend with a minimum of 3 starts. He's got one of the best averages there. Coming in at 10% ownership, that might be, it seems like a relatively good ownership there. We already talked about Russell Henley. Wyndham Clark has shown bits and pieces, but not the full game. Not sure I can fully get there. Maybe target him for a fat start. Look at that top 5 or top 10 first round market for Wyndham Clark. Sam Burns' irons are not good enough for me to get involved with at all. So he fits in with that mid 9K range of golfers that I'm just not playing. Now, when we head to Tony Finau had a horrible round 3, horrible round 4, losing 7.98 strokes tee to green. Wow, that is unfortunately means that there was one blow-up hole. So similarly, as I talked about with Aberg, losing 4.4 strokes on his approaches in just 2 holes. For Tony Finau, he lost in just 2 holes, the 12th and the 17th on Sunday. He lost 2.5 strokes around the green and another 3.2 strokes on his approaches. Again, that's just 2 holes on one day. So we add those back into his averages. He would then become average strokes gained around the green for the tournament. His approaches would then go up to about a half a stroke on average gain. And his putting matched the field. When Tony Finau is matching the field in putting, you know he's going to put up numbers. So let's just throw out the bad round there on Sunday. Let's look at the around the green becoming easier this week and see if Tony Finau can get himself into the mix. Definitely like him more on the DFS side. Given that his ownership is coming in at 4.2%, I think it's an easy way to get 8 or 9 or 10% if you're playing mass multi-entry. But in the betting market, I don't think there's enough to go on there. Okay, well, let's Shane Lowry next. Shane Lowry playing some really good golf, showing that he can compete through this Florida swing. I see no reason that that's going to stop this week. coming off of back-to-back top 15 finishes here to start the first couple of weeks of March. And given that he's been really doing it with all parts of his game pitching in at certain points, and that I believe the driving for him will be easier this week than it was last week. I think he can put to use that strong approach around the green and putting right now. I think the off-the-tee regression maybe that we saw last week that held him back from top 5 finish does solve itself. So Shane Lowry firmly in play, 14% ownership for on the DFS side. I think that there's definitely warrant there to get slightly overweight, maybe to that 18 to 20% range. And then for the betting markets, Shane Lowry, I think that a top 20 market for Shane Lowry certainly is something that we can take a look at here this week. Obviously, we haven't quite seen the winning form, so even though it's 40 to 1, I'm not ready to get there. But top 20, you're going to get around plus 180 for that number. I think that's a really solid price for Lowry at the top 20. Okay, I know everybody will want to hear my Jordan Spieth take, but there's really not much to say. He's turning into a bit of a boom or bust candidate, either missing the cut or getting himself at least around or into the mix. But this golf course has proven to give him big-time difficulties in the past. So for me, it's an easy avoid. Victor Hovland is interesting at 5% ownership. I think for the DFS side, this is a good spot to get overweight. He had a big-time putting struggles last week where he missed the cut. He is going through swing coaches, but when you lose 6-stroke putting, it doesn't matter if you gain 4 strokes on the approach because you're not going to end up making the cut. And he did not. So maybe he was able to go up to Ponte Vedra a couple of weeks early, work on the approach game, and work on the putting game. And maybe we see a bit of a spike for Victor Hovland this week. 5% ownership, I think it's definitely a good spot to go. I think it's easier to get to him on DFS. I think betting, we do probably need to see more before we are going to go into anything like, Hovland's back. However, if you do want to get a little bit of money down, his first-round player number of birdies coming in at 4 on Caesars, if you have that available, certainly seems to be like a good number. 4.5 at FanDuel as well is the exact same thing. So FanDuel minus 115 is that number. I think it's a pretty solid one for Victor if he is going to have a spike putting day. If his approaches stay as good as they were in the first 2 rounds last week, he definitely will make more than 4 birdies. So look for Victor Hovland over the amount of birdies of 4.5 on FanDuel for a bet on Victor. Okay, 2 spots in the 8,000 range that I want to talk about for DFS purposes. Byung Hyun An coming in at 1.4%, which does make sense as Hyun An has really not played well this year. But even a tie for 8th last week at the Arnold Palmer, things started to look really good. He's notoriously pretty good around the green. That's the only spot he lost strokes in last week. So I think it's an interesting spot. He is coming in hot. He's a form golfer. So at the ownership projection of somewhere around 2%, 1.4%, I think Byung Hyun An certainly is in the mix for a DFS play. Similarly, Minwoo Lee at 8,000, guy that definitely has popped up in a few big events, notorious for the British Open a couple of years ago. I think last week at Bay Hill, the golf course, when you spray the ball off the tee on that golf course, you get into big time trouble. The rough was very long and all that. However, here at Sawgrass, you don't really have that ability to as much at Bay Hill. You can't take driver out as much. You're forced to go down to certain clubs. So I think the setup should certainly be easier for Minwoo Lee here at TPC Sawgrass. And at 3.3% ownership, I think it's a very good play to take a look at. Been noticing that Nick Taylor has been getting a lot of steam this week, coming in at 9% owned. And that makes sense, as he has shown time and time again that he is a player and can perform at some of the biggest stages. His approach game last week looked great, getting over 4 strokes. And he's a spike putter, meaning he's going to lose some rounds. He's going to lose some events. And then there will be other events where he gains 5-6 strokes putting. And for him, that's just how it works. Other golfers are in similar boats. And for him, he is gaining a little bit of steam coming in at 9% owned, which is interesting because Max Grayson, who is also playing some very good golf, coming in at 3.7% owned, is also a really good target for DFS purposes as he's playing some solid golf coming off of a good finish at the Arnold Palmer last week, where it really wasn't just one facet of his game. He was able to gain strokes, yes, with his putter, but also around the green, more or less match the field with his off the tee game, but he will need to improve his approaches if he wants to maintain this level of form. However, for DraftKings purposes at 3.7%, I think it's easy to get slightly overweight. Christian Bezuidenhout is another guy that's coming in at very low ownership for DFS purposes of 6.6%. And a guy that has played consistently here at TPC Sawgrass, a guy that doesn't really do anything superbly, but does have an above average to good short game. And his best statistical category might be his putter. Anyone that's a great putter can save themselves in rounds where they may not be hitting it as well. So at 6% ownership, I think he's an easy one that's able to get to. A block of golfers in the 6.7 to 6,000 range that I think are worthy enough of getting into a player pool this week include J.J. Spawn, Ben Griffin, Max McGreevy, Billy Horschel, Max Homa, Tom Hoagie, Laurie Cantor, and Bo Hostler. Dipping below the 6,000 range, Michael Kim has been talked about quite a bit as one of the best plays of the slate. However, that means it comes with high ownership. So I think you need to be contest specific here with Michael Kim. Whereas if he does, in fact, end up missing the cut, you want to try and get as much leverage as possible. I think you can take advantage of that in the single entry events like the $200 on DraftKings, where his ownership is typically double that of ones you'd see in the Million Maker. So I think in the Millionaire Maker for DraftKings, I think the 15% ownership that's projected is fine. Whereas in the $200 in single entry, the 30% ownership that I think we could see is something to leverage. So let's get contest specific here with Michael Kim. Hello? Jake Knapp is another guy that's interesting who just didn't get into the Arnold Palmer Invitational, but has played some great golf. 59 at the Honda Classic, or excuse me, the Cognizant Classic a few weeks ago, is nothing to scoff at, and at 5% ownership, I think he's an easy one to add to the portfolio at 5,900, especially in something like that single entry where we know a lot of the lineups will be going to Michael Kim. The next two guys that I think worthy of talking about are Rasmus and Nikolai Højgaard, twins, here playing this week, both with expected ownership of around 5%. Nikolai's playing in the morning and Rasmus is playing in the afternoon. If we want a differentiator, 14 of the last 16 winners have had the AM/PM tee time shift. So Nikolai Højgaard, maybe that's why we take the favor there. They are very similar players, very similar profiles. So for Højgaard, I will take Nikolai this week. Eric Cole is an interesting name who was mentioned on the telecast this past week at the Arnold Palmer Invitational that he's dealing with a little bit of a wrist issue or wrist soreness. So for me, I think there's enough names outside of Eric Cole that I don't need to get to Eric Cole this week. I think Doug Gim, even coming in higher ownership, is fine there at 8.8% with 5,600. Patrick Rogers also playing good golf this year, 2.7% owned, playing solidly enough to certainly warrant consideration in a big field tournament, as well as Taylor Moore. Lastly, Carl Phillips. It was great to hit on Carl Phillips last week, winning the Puerto Rico Open. However, big win. Sometimes wins like that for young players like Phillips can have a bit of a letdown that next tournament we saw. Although Aldrich Potgieter did not win the Arnold Palmer last week after a second place finish at the Mexico Open, it was a big letdown there at the Arnold Palmer last week. So for Phillips, I think we can wait and see for another week. There's plenty of other names in that mid 5,500 range that are playing good golf that include Alex Smalley, who's been really good all year, statistically speaking, gaining strokes in almost every category. Just hasn't quite had the top end finish that we're looking for. So maybe it comes this weekend. Players Championship. He's coming in at 5,400 and 6.4% on. Seems like a good spot. Lastly, Matty Schmid, 5,300. I think that's a great place for Matty Schmid here this week. Also, there's a couple of other markets for Matty Schmid that you might want to take a look at that include the top German market that is available on certain sports.